Delighted to welcome as our next speaker, Professor Mark Edwards. Mark Edwards is Professor of Early Christian Studies at Oxford University and a tutor in theology at Christ Church. Since 2018, he's also acted as Senior Proctor of the University. His research interests include early Christianity, the New Testament, and Platonism. The title of Professor Edwards' paper is Writing and Amnesia, Some Quest for Jesus in Schweitzer.
Perhaps I should just point out that the proctorship at Oxford lasts for only 1 year, so I'm no longer senior proctor. Anyway, this paper is entitled Some Quests for Jesus That Schweitzer Forgot. Had Albert Schweitzer done nothing else, his quest for the historical Jesus would have guaranteed his immortality in the field of biblical studies. In content, it outweighs many tomes which are heavier on the shelf, and since these tomes must also be read by biblical scholars, no one will regret that it runs to only 400 pages, in English at least, when it might have run to 4,000. When, therefore, I speak in the present paper of his omissions, it is not in the spirit of hostile animadversion. I am merely pointing out that no one book can contain the world, because success in communication depends on our limiting ourselves with some strictness to a particular set of topics and a particular line of thought. On the same principle, I shall limit myself in this presentation to works in English, which were not written by professional students of the New Testament. Schweitzer's neglect of English authors is in part a consequence of his lacking the proficiency in that language that he professed in French and German, but also, I would guess, a consequence of the absence of any distinct academic discipline of biblical studies in England before the latter half of the 19th century. This is not to say that no seminal work was done, but that like many advances in history, philosophy, and even the natural sciences, it was done by authors whom Schweitzer would have regarded as dilettantes. The role that English deism played in fostering German scepticism was not yet admitted in Schweitzer's day on either side of the Channel. Today, I hope it will not seem wholly incongruous that I should begin with John Locke, a student, that is, fellow, of Christ Church in Oxford, who has nonetheless been credited with inventing the uniquely English virtue of common sense. I shall pass on to other authors who might seem rather to exemplify the equally notorious English trait of eccentricity. My purpose at all times, however, is to demonstrate that a narrowly academic definition of biblical scholarship conceals the fact that this field has been repeatedly irrigated by other disciplines, and that had it been closed to such influences, the resultant sterility would have been too high a price for the specious gain in purity and rigour. Few writers have shaped the course of Christian thought in England so powerfully as John Locke, for all his reputation as an infidel. His principle of beginning only from common sense, without deference to authority, formed the basis of much apologetic reasoning. While the arguments for religious toleration, which exposed him to peril and obloquy in his lifetime, have long ago achieved the status of political axioms. And although his most fervid opponents in the early modern era included Protestants who professed to teach only what was revealed in Scripture, his essay on the reasonableness of Christianity, as delivered in the Scriptures, shows him to be as candid and assiduous as any of his contemporaries in his reading of the Gospels. A faithful expositor in every sense, he assumes that all 4 Gospels are historically true and accurate, implicitly justifying the plurality of narratives by using each to supplement the lacunae in the others. 200 years before Reda, and long before the priority of Mark was even suspected, he draws attention to what we now regard as a salient feature of that book, the refusal of Jesus to confess, either to the multitude or to his innermost disciples, the messianic identity which he was nonetheless advertising by his miracles and his appropriation of prophecies from the Old Testament. Since Locke regards this as a feature of the historical ministry, he explains it as a stratagem which Jesus employed to ensure that his death would not preempt the fulfillment of his mission. He is not, in Locke's view, the incarnate Son of God, but he is sufficiently above the common rank to crown his ministry of good works with a willing submission to the malice of his foes, in order to set before us an example of perfect humility and self-renunciation. We may feel that Locke pays too little attention to the passages in which Jesus' commands to secrecy are flouted or cannot be satisfied, and therefore fails to anticipate Rader's verdict that the secretive motif is a theologumenon rather than a veridical tradition. Nevertheless, Locke correctly divines, with Rader, that the Jesus of Mark, who for him is the Jesus of history, did not wish to be known as the Messiah before his death. While Schweitzer evinced little interest in the empirical school of philosophy at any time in his life, he could hardly have omitted to say, in his quest for the historical Jesus, that Hegel was the intellectual mentor of the Tübingen School of New Testament Studies, whose notion of a critical approach to historiography was to doubt everything that could be doubted. The Hegelianism of David Friedrich Strauss, however, is judged to be of a wholly negative character, since it led him not so much to idealize Jesus as to deny him any demonstrable attribute beyond his existence, his death on the cross, and his preaching of the kingdom. The miracles, from the virgin birth to the raising of Lazarus, were artificial translations of biblical prophecy into the biographical mode. The marvellous fulfilment of so many messianic intimations was in fact no marvel at all, except in the sense that no such synthesis of so many testimonies had hitherto been imagined. Imagination it was, nonetheless, and Schweitzer represents Strauss as a virtuoso of incredulity, much as Johannes Zachaber has recently perceived in his work the triumph of the critical element over the idealistic element in the programme which Strauss inherited from his teacher, S.C. Barr. We are left to surmise that when Strauss describes the Gospel as myth, he means simply that it is not true. A little reference is made by Schweitzer to Strauss's prologue to the life of Jesus, in which he argues that Christ as myth is a more potent figure than the Jesus of history, because he embodies a human ideal to which all who come after him can aspire. Myth is not for Strauss a merely pejorative term. His own allusions to Karl Gottfried Müller, one of the greatest proponents of the study of mythology in the early 19th century, reveal that he was well aware of the high esteem in which myth had come to be held as a concrete means of portraying the subliminal laws that govern a whole society and the ends for which it strives. Schweitzer not only implies that the mythological reading is merely corrosive to the historical claims of the Gospel, he also gives the impression that Strauss was the first to subject the New Testament to the scepticism that already governed the scholarly reading of the Hebrew Scriptures. He loses sight of the legacy that was most seminal for his own work because he takes so little account of the milieu from which the life of Jesus emerged, the life of Jesus by Strauss. Had he been less negligent of English writing, he might have come upon the remarkable works of the Reverend Robert Taylor, who was already preaching, a generation before Strauss, that the putative life of Jesus was a literary confection, whose ingredients could be found in the ancient records of all societies. Thus, in Taylor's Diegesis, Jesus becomes by turns an avatar of Aesculapius, Mercury, Hercules, Bacchus, Apollo, Prometheus, Adonis, and even Krishna. Baptism is a universal ablution, while the Eucharist fell from the table of the Eleusinian mysteries. In his astrotheology, Taylor demonstrates that the Gospel is an astrological cipher, in which the 12 apostles stand for signs of the zodiac, being represented as fishermen because Pisces is the first sign in the calendar. Greek and Latin records of the ancient civilizations of the Near East are quoted, much as Josephus, Tacitus, and the Talmud are quoted today, with a credulity that scarcely appears consistent with the author's sceptical handling of the Gospels. The staff that accompanies Peter in iconography reveals without further scrutiny that he is Janus, the divine personification of the new year. Taylor, it should be said, is doing nothing out of the ordinary except for a man of the cloth, for the reduction of purportedly historical personages to astral signs was a stock in trade of mythographers in his own day, and for a century after. Britain's own hero, King Arthur, had been unmasked as a star Arcturus, an etymology which is put beyond doubt by the fact that Arthur's Wain is an alternative name for the Great Bear, which points to Arcturus with its tail. Why, one might ask, should a scholar of Schweitzer's erudition have troubled himself with such nonsense, any more than we trouble ourselves today with such a pigany of Taylor as J.M. Robertson, whose attempt to revive the identification of Christ with Krishna was laughed into oblivion by the classicist F.C. Conybeare. Would a modern Schweitzer have wasted even a sentence on the short-lived notoriety of John Allegro's The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross? This would be a fair criticism, were not the very obscurity of these lucubrations a measure of Strauss's sanity and his contribution to the sanity of biblical studies. But for one or two episodes, such as the virgin birth, Strauss does not look for the sources of the gospel outside its manifest and frequently noted foreshadowings in the prophets and histories of the Old Covenant. By turning on its head the ancient discipline of typology, Strauss explained the known through the known, where rival theories were nourished only by conjecture, and he brought to light a unity of design where others found only a kaleidoscope of disparate motifs. All theories of the gospel as myth, except his own, were routed by the life of Jesus, including, we may add, any academic theory, however distinguished the author, which disguised the indebtedness of the church to Israel. Schweitzer, who insists at all times on the Jewish matrix of early Christian thought, had cause to thank Strauss for delivering biblical studies from the insular Protestantism of Schleiermacher. He also lived to witness a fanatical assault upon the Jews, waged partly in the name of Christendom, and all the more plausibly because a new fashion for demythologizing had professed to discover the roots of Christianity in a hypothetical tissue of Indo-European symbols, free of Semitic associations, to which Bultmann and Reitzenstein gave the name Gnosticism. Bultmann held with Schweitzer that eschatology was at the core of Jesus' preaching. He also held with Strauss that an eschatology pruned of its mythopoeic dress could be the wellspring of a modern Christian faith. Some would say that as Strauss appeals from the old mythology to that of Hegel, so Bultmann appeals to that of Heidegger. Schweitzer had little interest in the redemption of teachings that he thought obsolete, and barely paused in his quest to discuss contemporary experiments in this vein. Once again, his indifference to writing in English, and to work which fell outside the academic domain, prevented him from pursuing any attempt to circumvent the impasse to which he himself had brought the historical criticism of the life of Jesus. In the last part of this paper, I shall notice 3 reflections by English authors which might have opened such a thoroughfare, the last of which is of all the more interest because it anticipates his own work on Paul. By the common consent of Anglicans in the early 20th century, not least among those who were of a fairly conservative persuasion, the most profound attempt to repossess John for the modern mind was the work of a poet, rather than a professional scholar. Robert Browning's Death in the Desert, inspired by the old, though inauthentic tradition that John's last words to his disciples were, "Little children, love one another," works its way to love through the questioning of faith. The evangelist, no longer a witness of the signs and wonders that he recalls, foresees a time when his readers will surmise that his gospel, like a Greek myth, is true not in what it recounts, but in what it signifies. This is not in itself to be regretted, for we are made to grow, as Newman has said, to quite another purpose, and the nourishing vigour of fire is more real to us than any narrative of its origins, whether Prometheus lived or not. Miracles no longer occur, if they ever did, because mature souls do not need them, just as the faith of those who have not seen, according to Jesus himself, is higher than that of those who have seen, since it rests not on his transient works, but on his timeless words. The Apostle's fear in Browning's poem is that those who outgrow the literal sense today will outgrow the allegory tomorrow. What if, having learned to abandon anthropomorphic fables for a metaphysic of love and power and will, one should decide that love has been dethroned by science as surely as myth was dethroned by philosophy? The only test can be our conviction that that is true, which we deem most worthy to be true. The exegete draws the soul from the text as a sculptor elicits beauty from stone, by experiment and conjecture, by meditation and reflection, with no other science to guide him than his intuitive sense that the chisel has found its mark. Any English poet of Browning's time would be more aware of Strauss than of his philosophical antecedents. A more Hegelian strategy for reconciling the Jesus of history to the Christ of faith is suggested by Francis Herbert Bradley's essay, Who is the Real Julius Caesar? Bradley was the doyen of an Oxford school of idealists, known, though not to themselves, as the British Hegelians, who refused to accept the dominant view that the world is an aggregate of discrete realities, observed but in no way constituted by the discrete reality which I call my intellect. On the contrary, they maintained, the knower and the object of knowledge form a complex whole, no part of which can be adequately characterised without reference to the others. Bradley is particularly remembered for his argument that relations must be internal to the things that they relate, since if they were external, we must ask what it is that relates a relation to that which it relates. While he gladly embraced the implication that since everything is related to something, the world which appears to us as a multiplicity must in fact be one in reality, Bradley did not align himself with Christians who were urging the same position, and never gave the name God to the absolute unity which is ubiquitously present in, but never identical with, the phenomenal. For all that, it is clearly just as legitimate to extend his essay on Caesar to Christology as to apply his doctrine of internal relations to the classic model of the Trinity, as has been done by some scholars. Any person, Bradley argues, has a subjective consciousness whose experiences belong to it and no other subject. Selfhood implies a sense of being set over against other beings. We are not, however, set against them as monads whose relations are established from without. Each of us is a centre of experiences and phenomena which continue to be related to us even after we have undergone physical death. Caesar forms a whole, not only with all that he knew in his bodily life, but with all that he foresaw and with all that he caused. All that is known or believed of him forms part of that which constitutes him, although it is not coterminous with the consciousness that said, I am Julius Caesar. Had Bradley been a student of the Gospels, like his friend Bosanquet, he would have had no difficulty in identifying the Christ whom the Church remembers with the real Jesus, and would have argued that the words ascribed to Jesus in the fourth Gospel are all the more his if they were not heard from his own lips, but put into the mind of the author by that Spirit, whom he gave to the Church as a second paraclete. Bradley and Browning, each in his own way, took up the positive element in Strauss's Life of Jesus, whereas Schweitzer made it his task to contest the extreme negativity of his critical reasoning. Far from despairing of the historical Jesus, he constructs an account of his ministry which includes a confident summary of his eschatological teaching, a chronology of the decisive events, and an evocation of the mental process which transformed him from a mere prophet to a messianic incendiary who believed that his death would precipitate the last judgment. Thus he made of Christ a figure whom few could see as a possible object of faith, in contrast to Strauss, who believed that by rescuing Jesus both from superstitious literalists and from naturalists who explained away what they purported to explain, he was teaching his contemporaries that the true Christ is an idea and not a man. Schweitzer did not follow the path of his own contemporary Alfred Loisy, who urged that the kingdom had come in the form of the church, and not, as Jesus had erroneously foretold, with the end of the world. Schweitzer's paradoxical resolution to live by the interims ethic of the Sermon on the Mount reveals little sympathy with the existentialism of Rudolf Bultmann, which translates the expectation of the kingdom into a vertiginous fear of acting inauthentically, but cannot tell us what an authentic act would be. Both the Jesus whose delusions were exposed by Schweitzer and the Jesus whose teaching he followed were to him the historical Jesus, and in his writing on the Gospels he appears to admit no other. Yet he was certainly familiar with a primitive, perhaps the most primitive strand of Christian thought, which did not confine the life of Jesus to his earthly ministry, but maintains that his abiding body on earth is constituted by all those, whether living or dead, who are united to him by faith, and have forsaken the carnal life for that which is hidden with him in God. This is not the kerygma or proclamation of Bultmann, which is all but coterminous with the death of Jesus on the cross. It is not the doctrine of Loisy, for whom the last trump and the second coming of Christ were abortive reveries whose only real equivalent was the church. Schweitzer admits that even when the name Christ replaces that of Jesus in Paul, it is the name of a historical figure born of a woman and crucified. But since his own encounter with this man was through his resurrection, the Jesus Christ whom Paul proclaimed was not the preacher of Nazareth, but the seed whom God had promised to raise up to Abraham, the one for whose sake the law was given, and hence the one who abolished it by dying under its curse, in order that those without and those within might come together in expectation of his return. The faith of the saints, according to Schweitzer's interpretation of Paul, is the sense of being forever in Christ, not just a conviction of having been released by his sacrifice from the penalty of sin. Schweitzer prepares the way for the new perspective on Paul, which would not have been entirely new to the Fathers or to the Catholic tradition, and which is evidently superior to the old Lutheran perspective in at least two respects. It does not define Christianity as the negation of Judaism, and it shows that the alienation of faith from works is plausible only when we ignore every mention of the resurrection in the Epistle to the Romans, as Luther indeed did in his commentary on Romans, even before his breach with Rome. Schweitzer did not pretend to be entirely without precursors in his mysticism of Paul the Apostle. German scholars before him, he observed, had been driven to postulate an antinomy in Paul between the juridical understanding of salvation as a free pardon on account of the merits of Christ and an ethical understanding which requires us to perform the moral ordinances of the Jewish law, or rather to outperform them by works of love. Pfleiderer had gone so far as to coin the term mystic ethical, but the bondage of German theology to Kant and ritual had hitherto precluded the recognition of eschatology as the key to the reconciliation of these jarring elements. Only when we apprehend that Christ in Paul is the incarnation of that to which the law pointed, superseding it by an obedience to the Spirit, which was perceived as disobedience to the letter, can we enter into the paradox of dying to live, of being set free from law by law, in order that we might better fulfill the law, which is what Paul means by being in Christ. Schweitzer also remarks that the false antinomy between the juridical and the ethical strain in Paul had often been reduced to an antithesis between Jewish and Hellenistic modes of thought. It is all the more surprising, then, that one of his unnoticed predecessors, unnoticed together with every other English student of Paul and his interpreters, should have been the great poet and critic Matthew Arnold, who had constantly bewailed the prevalence of the Hebraic over the Hellenic in the cultural and literary tastes of his countrymen. Arnold believed, nonetheless, that it was the Hebraic, meaning of course the biblical element, that had formed the moral sense of the English people. And whatever claims he made on behalf of culture, conduct was to Arnold 3/4 of life. The Puritans, who regarded themselves as custodians of the moral sense, were the principal foes of scientific progress and cultural discrimination. The object of Arnold's Pauline Protestantism is to show them that they were not the true interpreters of Paul, whom they take for their idol, perhaps not in all respects true disciples even of Calvin. There are modern admirers of Calvin who would argue that he anticipated Schweitzer in defining salvation not as freedom from judgment, but as union with Christ, entailing at once our justification under the law and our sanctification through obedience. And certainly the Puritan life at its best often mirrored this assumption. Be that as it may, Matthew Arnold was the heir to a tradition in English thought which found a way between Rome and Calvin, between Augustine's ecclesiology and Augustine's predestinarianism, by teaching the synergy of faith and works, which Augustine himself derived from Paul's own words at Galatians 5:6, faith that works by love. Paul, says Arnold, was animated, as only the Jew can be, by a thirst for righteousness, God being, in Arnold's phrase, the eternal, not ourselves, that makes for righteousness. Like any Jew, the apostle equated righteousness with access to God, and therefore could not sever it from obedience to the law in which God's character is disclosed. Like all who desire perfection, however, he found his powers insufficient, until a sudden encounter convinced him that the risen Christ was the promised Messiah of Israel, in whom all righteousness had been fulfilled. His system therefore begins with the discovery of the risen Christ as the one who frees us from sin, not, as the Puritan imagines, with the pusillanimous search for a means of saving ourselves from the penalty of sin. He did not begin from the cross, but was brought back to it by the question, how can I be in Christ? To which the answer was, by dying to all that binds us to sin, in order that we may live again in a mystical bond, to use Arnold's word, with the one to whom sin is unknown. Although he describes the Messiah as one who will come with the sound of trumpets, Arnold makes much less than Schweitzer of Pauline eschatology, though he concurs with him in assuming that Paul's thought is above all Jewish in its roots. Opposing the elusive sense of taste to the frigidity of what is now called practical criticism, he scoffed at Strauss as an over-ingenious pedant, and extolled Ernest Renan, whom Schweitzer despised. For all that, Arnold reads Paul closely and judiciously, if not so comprehensively as Schweitzer, and with less attention to the original Greek. Had Schweitzer read Arnold, he might have been forced to admit that biblical scholars can learn from literary critics, and he might have revised the biographical preface to his chapter on Strauss, which seems to hint that the shortcomings of the Tübingen master arose from a youthful habit of reading poetry with his friends.